My sister tried to rip my newborn out of my arms in front of nurses, then filed a CPS report claiming my husband beat her. When I begged her to stop calling herself Mama at the hospital, she smiled and said, "He's Josh. He knows who I am. You were just the carrier." I stayed silent. That was 18 months ago. Last night, she stood outside our new house in the rain, cradling a doll and whispering lullabies to it like it could hear her. My sister Layla was 7 months pregnant with her miracle baby when she got spiked and taken advantage of by one of her closest male friends. She regained consciousness 12 hours later, now with a flat belly, bruising near her nether regions, and dried blood all around her thighs. The guy got off on a suspended sentence. I became pregnant 18 months ago, and Layla saw this as her miracle boy being reborn in my womb. She showed up to the hospital while I was in labor with fake documents. She's a surrogate. I'm the real mother. My parents were right there backing her up. Layla tried to literally rip my baby out of my arms when the nurses wouldn't listen to her. For the next week, Layla visited daily and called herself Mama in front of everyone. She'd take hundreds of photos and post them online as her newborn. It got so overwhelming I had to block her, but she retaliated by filing a false CPS report. While the worker was at our house, Layla showed up with our parents. "We're concerned too," they said. Layla even had a black eye painted on with makeup. Her husband gave this to me, but I chose not to press charges because he was just drinking heavily and didn't mean it. The worker called me and my husband in for an interview. Sam was placed with Layla during the investigation. I spent every second fearing my baby would be taken away from me. But 2 weeks later, our names were finally cleared. My husband and I drove to Layla's house, where we found Sam basically incapacitated in his crib. My husband physically restrained Layla, and as I scooped Sam up into my arms, he instinctively hugged me and buried his head into my chest. Layla screamed, "I'm going to get him back." 7 days later, I woke up to our nanny cam detecting motion in our daughter's room. Layla was holding Sam, who was already crying. She used the spare key I forgot she had and was humming a lullaby, telling him, "Mommy's here." When I whispered screamed at her, she told me to be quiet because I would wake Josh up, not Sam. Josh, the boy she was meant to give birth to all those years ago. She only handed Sam back to me because I called the police. My husband and I went straight to court. We filed a restraining order, but the judge denied it. He said there was no credible threat of violence shown, and it didn't help that my parents took her side during the testimony. Sadly for Layla, her husband filed for divorce after seeing the security footage played in court. Layla blamed us for that. "You turned him against me. You stole my husband just like you stole my baby." By the time the divorce was settled, Layla had spent the entire few months planning. She'd gotten our mom to make her a copy of our new house keys, and one night, she used them to silently break in. I woke up at 5 a.m. to an empty crib. I panicked harder than I ever had, and after reviewing the nanny footage, I called 911. An Amber Alert was issued, as well as a medical emergency warning. The next few days were terrifying. Sam had an autoimmune disease and needed my milk to live. The only reason he'd lived during that time with Layla was because I'd given her all the bottles I had. Now Sam didn't have my milk. 72 hours later, the police called me. They found Layla in an apartment 2 states away. Sam was critically ill and severely dehydrated, with his organs beginning to fail. They airlifted Sam to the nearest hospital and told me they couldn't guarantee his survival. While he was in the PICU, a psychiatric evaluation was carried out on Layla. They found complete false documentation in her apartment, including a fake birth certificate and forged custody papers showing her as the mother. She'd even created a fake social security number for Sam. Her plan was to claim she'd just gotten emergency custody from a neglectful mother. The apartment lease had been established months prior, and she'd already told the landlord she was getting custody of her sister's baby. Now, Sam was fighting for his life, and our parents hired Layla the best lawyer they could afford in the hopes of getting her off on a technicality. The lawyer my parents hired for Layla was Theodore Makoter, a man who specialized in finding technicalities in child endangerment cases. I discovered this when I overheard my mother on the phone arranging payment plans with his office. She was standing in our hospital hallway, completely oblivious to my presence as she discussed how they could spin Layla's actions as a mental health crisis rather than kidnapping. I walked past her without acknowledgement and returned to Sam's room. The machine surrounding his tiny body beeped steadily, monitoring his fragile vitals. The doctors had managed to stabilize him, but he remained critically weak. His skin had lost its healthy pink glow, replaced by a grayish pallor that made my chest tighten every time I looked at him. My husband sat in the corner chair, dark circles under his eyes from 3 nights without sleep. He'd been documenting everything on his phone, every medical update, every conversation with staff, every moment of Sam's recovery. We both knew Layla wouldn't stop here, and we needed evidence of what her actions had done to our son. The next morning, a social worker named Beatrice arrived. She introduced herself as part of the hospital's family services team, but I immediately sensed something was off. She asked pointed questions about our home environment, our parenting choices, and whether we'd considered that Layla might have legitimate concerns about Sam's welfare. I watched my husband's jaw clench as Beatrice suggested we might benefit from family mediation with Layla. She pulled out forms for us to sign, authorizing her to facilitate meetings between all parties. My husband stood up, walked to the door, and held it open. Beatrice gathered her papers and left, but not before mentioning she'd be back with a court order if necessary. That afternoon, while I was expressing milk for Sam's feeding tube, my phone buzzed with notifications. Layla had started a social media campaign. She'd posted dozens of photos from her time with Sam, carefully cropped to exclude any signs of his deteriorating health. The captions painted her as a devoted aunt who'd been forced to take drastic action to protect her nephew from negligent parents. The comment section was flooded with support from people who didn't know the real story. Some even offered to start fundraisers for her legal defense. I screenshot everything before blocking her new accounts, but more kept appearing. She'd clearly prepared for this, creating multiple profiles in advance. My daughter, who'd been staying with my husband's parents during the crisis, called that evening. She was crying, saying kids at school were asking if her parents were really as bad as their moms were saying on Facebook. The rumor mill in our small town was churning, fed by Layla's carefully crafted narrative of a mentally ill woman trying to save a baby from abuse. 2 days later, Sam was finally stable enough to remove some of the monitoring equipment. As I held him for the first time since his rescue, feeling his weak but determined grip on my finger, my father appeared in the doorway. He stood there silently, watching us with an expression I couldn't read. He finally spoke, telling me that Layla needed help, not persecution. He insisted we were destroying the family by pursuing charges against her. When I reminded him that Sam had nearly died, he shook his head and claimed we were exaggerating. Layla had told him Sam was fine when she had him, that the hospital was lying about his condition to help our case. My husband returned from the cafeteria to find my father lecturing me about family loyalty. Without a word, he positioned himself between us and suggested my father leave. As my father walked out, he muttered about how we'd regret turning our backs on family when we needed them most. The psychiatric evaluation results came back that week. Layla had been diagnosed with delusional disorder, specifically the persecutory type with elements of grandiosity. The psychiatrist noted her complete conviction that Sam was her deceased child reborn, and her belief that everyone involved in keeping them apart was part of a conspiracy against her. Theodore McHodor used this diagnosis to push for treatment instead of jail time. He filed motion after motion, each one attempting to reframe Layla's actions as symptoms of grief-induced psychosis rather than calculated kidnapping. The prosecutor warned us that juries often sympathize with mental health defenses, especially when family members testified on the defendant's behalf. My mother began visiting the hospital daily, not to see Sam, but to leave gifts and cards for Layla in the lobby. She'd tell anyone who'd listen about Layla's tragic loss years ago, how it had broken her daughter's mind. The hospital security eventually had to ban her from the premises after she tried to sneak into the psychiatric ward to visit Layla. During this time, I discovered Layla had been planning this for months before Sam was even born. She joined online support groups for parents who'd lost custody, learning their terminology and tactics. She'd studied interstate custody laws and specifically chose an apartment in a state with weaker extradition protocols for family abduction cases. The apartment lease revealed more disturbing details. She'd been telling neighbors for months about her upcoming custody battle, painting herself as a devoted mother, fighting against a system biased toward birth parents. She'd even decorated a nursery, complete with a crib identical to the one in our home and clothes in Sam's exact sizes. My husband found something even more chilling in our home security footage from the weeks before the kidnapping. Layla had been testing our routines, checking when we were deepest asleep, timing how long it took us to respond to Sam's cries. She'd made several practice runs, entering and leaving without taking him, perfecting her approach. The prosecutor showed us text messages between Layla and our mother from those weeks. My mother had been providing detailed updates about our schedules, Sam's feeding times, and even which nights we seemed most exhausted. She'd been an active participant in planning the abduction, though she claimed she thought Layla just wanted to spend time with her nephew. As Sam slowly recovered, gaining weight and regaining his strength, the legal battle intensified. Theodore McCoder filed a motion to have the charges reduced from kidnapping to custodial interference, arguing that Layla genuinely believed she had a right to take Sam. He presented her fake documents as evidence of mental illness rather than criminal intent. The prosecutor countered with evidence of premeditation, the months of planning, the fake identity created for Sam, the deliberate choice of location. But Theodore McCoder was skilled at his job, weaving a narrative of a grieving woman driven to desperate measures by a cruel family who'd excluded her from her nephew's life. My husband and I spent hours with the prosecutor going over every detail of our testimony. We learned that my parents had already given depositions supporting Layla's version of events. They'd claimed we'd been unnecessarily cruel to Layla, refusing to let her have a normal aunt relationship with Sam, which had triggered her breakdown. The truth was that we tried to include Layla initially, before her behavior became concerning. We'd invited her to family dinners and let her hold Sam during visits, but her insistence on calling herself Mama and her attempts to breastfeed him had forced us to set boundaries she refused to respect. One evening, as I sat beside Sam's hospital crib, watching him sleep peacefully for the first time in days, I realized how much our lives had changed. The family I'd grown up trusting had become our greatest threat. The sister I'd once shared secrets with now saw my child as her possession. The parents who'd raised me were actively helping her try to steal him. But I also saw how the crisis had revealed true allies. My husband's family had rallied around us completely. His parents had taken time off work to help with our daughter, never questioning our decisions or suggesting we reconcile with Layla. Friends from our community had started their own social media campaign to counter Layla's lies, sharing the truth about what had really happened. As Sam's health improved, we began planning for the future. We knew the legal battle was far from over. Theodore McCoder had indicated he would push for a plea deal that included mandatory treatment, but no jail time. The prosecutor warned us that with my parents' testimony and the mental health defense, it might be the best outcome we could hope for. The prosecutor's warning proved prophetic when Theodore McCoder filed his next motion. He requested immediate release for Layla pending trial, citing her deteriorating mental state in custody. The motion included an affidavit from my parents describing Layla as a devoted sister who'd simply suffered a breakdown after years of untreated trauma. I watched my husband's knuckles turn white as he gripped the hospital bed rail while reading the document. The motion painted us as heartless relatives who denied a grieving woman access to the child she believed was her deceased baby. Theodore McCoder had even included photos of the nursery Layla had prepared in her apartment, presenting it as evidence of maternal instinct rather than premeditation. Our lawyer advised us to prepare for Layla's potential release. She explained that judges often granted bail in cases involving mental health defenses, especially with family support. My stomach churned at the thought of Layla walking free while Sam still recovered from what she'd done to him. 3 days after the motion was filed, we received word that the judge had scheduled a hearing. My parents would testify on Layla's behalf, along with a psychiatrist Theodore McCoder had hired. We scrambled to gather our own evidence, but the prosecutor warned us that emotional testimony from parents often swayed judges more than facts. The morning of the hearing arrived too quickly. I kissed Sam's forehead before leaving him with a trusted nurse, my heart racing at the thought of being away from him, even for a few hours. My husband held my hand as we entered the courthouse, both of us bracing for what we knew would be a painful confrontation with my family. Inside the courtroom, Layla sat beside Theodore McCoder, wearing a conservative dress that made her look fragile and vulnerable. She'd lost weight during her time in custody, and her hair hung limp around her face. When she saw us enter, her eyes lit up with an unsettling intensity. My mother rushed over to Layla, embracing her and whispering words of encouragement. My father stood nearby, shooting disapproving glances in our direction. Other relatives I hadn't seen in months filled the benches behind Layla, creating a show of family support that made my chest tighten. Theodore McCoder presented his case methodically. He called my mother to testify first, and she painted a picture of Layla as a broken woman who'd never recovered from losing her baby. She described how we'd cruelly excluded Layla from Sam's life, driving her to desperate measures. Her voice cracked as she begged the judge to show mercy. My father's testimony was even worse. He claimed we'd always been jealous of Layla, that we'd deliberately gotten pregnant to hurt her. He insisted that Layla's actions, while misguided, came from a place of love. He even suggested that supervised visits between Layla and Sam might help her healing process. The psychiatrist Theodore McCodor had hired testified next. He diagnosed Layla with a grief-induced psychotic break, claiming she genuinely believed Sam was her deceased child. He recommended intensive outpatient treatment rather than incarceration, arguing that jail would only worsen her condition. When our turn came to present evidence, the prosecutor did her best. She showed the security footage of Layla's break-ins, the fake documents she'd created, the months of planning revealed in her online activity. But I could see some jury members' faces soften when Theodore McCodor countered each point with explanations rooted in mental illness. The judge deliberated for less than an hour. When he returned, he granted Layla's release on bail with conditions. She would wear an ankle monitor, undergo mandatory psychiatric treatment, and stay away from our family. My parents would act as her custodians, responsible for ensuring she followed all court orders. Layla's eyes found mine as the bailiff removed her handcuffs. The look she gave me sent chills down my spine. It wasn't relief or gratitude, but calculation. I grabbed my husband's arm, knowing in my gut that this wasn't over. We rushed back to the hospital to find Sam awake and fussing for food. As I held him close, I made a decision. We couldn't stay in town with Layla free and my parents enabling her. My husband agreed immediately, and we began making plans to temporarily relocate. That night, while my husband researched extended stay hotels in neighboring cities, I received a text from an unknown number. The message contained a single photo. Sam's hospital bracelet, the one that had gone missing during Layla's kidnapping. The caption read, "He still needs his real mommy." I showed the message to hospital security, who immediately increased their presence around Sam's room. The police traced the number to a burner phone purchased with cash. They couldn't prove Layla had sent it, but we all knew the truth. Over the next few days, more messages arrived. Photos of Sam that Layla had taken during the kidnapping, each one captioned with disturbing claims about their bond. One showed him in the outfit she'd bought for Josh, with text saying he looked perfect in the clothes she'd chosen for her son. My husband installed new security apps on our phones and laptops. We changed all our passwords and enabled two-factor authentication on everything, but the feeling of being watched persisted. Every time we left the hospital, I found myself scanning the parking lot for familiar faces. A week after Layla's release, our daughter called from my in-laws' house in tears. Someone had been leaving baby clothes on their doorstep with notes addressed to Josh's big sister. The handwriting was disguised, but the message was clear. Layla knew where our daughter was staying. My husband drove immediately to collect her while I stayed with Sam. The 3-hour round trip felt like an eternity. I paced the hospital room, checking my phone constantly for updates. When they finally returned safely, our daughter clung to me, asking why Aunt Layla was being so scary. The police investigated the incidents at my in-laws' house, but found no evidence linking them to Layla. Without proof, they couldn't arrest her for violating the restraining order. Theodore McCodor sent a letter stating his client denied any involvement and suggesting we were paranoid. Meanwhile, Layla's social media campaign intensified. New accounts popped up daily, each one spreading her version of events. She'd started a blog called A Mother's Heart, where she wrote long posts about losing her baby and finding him again in Sam. The comment sections filled with supporters who believed her story. Local mom groups began taking sides. Some rallied around Layla, organizing meal trains and prayer circles for the grieving mother. Others supported us, but more quietly, afraid of getting involved in the drama. The division in our community made every grocery run feel like walking through a minefield. One afternoon, while Sam napped in his hospital crib, a woman I didn't recognize entered the room. She introduced herself as a lactation consultant, but something felt off when she reached for Sam, claiming she needed to check his latch. I blocked her path and called for security. The woman turned out to be a friend of Layla's from her online support group. She'd driven 2 hours to meet the baby Layla had told her so much about. Security escorted her out, but she screamed about injustice the entire way, calling me a baby thief who'd stolen Layla's child. That incident prompted the hospital to restrict access to Sam's room. Only people on a pre-approved list could enter, and everyone had to show ID. The extra security helped, but it also made us feel like prisoners in what should have been a place of healing. My parents' attempts to reconcile grew more aggressive. They showed up at the hospital despite being told to stay away, always with excuses about wanting to check on their grandson. Each time they mentioned how much Layla was suffering, how she just needed to see Sam to get better. During one particularly heated confrontation, my mother revealed that Layla had been hospitalized briefly for self-harm. She blamed us entirely, saying we'd driven Layla to hurt herself by keeping Sam away. The manipulation was so transparent, but it still made my chest tight with misplaced guilt. My husband lost his temper that day. He told my parents exactly what their enabling had caused. Sam nearly dying, our daughter living in fear, our entire life upended. He showed them photos of Sam in the PCU, hooked up to machines, fighting for his life because of Layla's actions. My father's response chilled me. He looked at the photos and said, "Layla must have had a good reason. You must have done something to make her desperate enough to take such drastic action." The complete denial of reality in his words made me realize my parents were beyond reasoning with. As Sam grew stronger, the doctors began discussing discharge plans. The thought of leaving the hospital's security terrified me. Our home no longer felt safe. Even with new locks and security systems, Layla knew our routines, our vulnerabilities. She'd proven she could wait and plan. We made the difficult decision to sell our house. My husband found a job opportunity in another state, far enough away to start fresh, but close enough to return for court dates. We told no one except his parents and our closest friends, knowing any information could make its way back to Layla through my parents. The house sold quickly, but closing would take weeks. In the meantime, we moved into a rental property on the other side of town, keeping the location secret from everyone except those who absolutely needed to know. We established new routines, varying our schedules to avoid predictability. Despite our precautions, Layla found ways to maintain her presence in our lives. Packages arrived at our old address: baby clothes, toys, items monogrammed with Josh. The post office forwarded them to our rental. Each delivery a reminder that she hadn't given up. One package particularly disturbed us. It contained a baby book filled out in Layla's handwriting, documenting Josh's milestones. She'd included photos from the kidnapping, writing captions about their special moments together. The final page contained a poem about a mother's love transcending all obstacles. We turned everything over to the police and prosecutor, building our case for the upcoming trial. Each piece of evidence painted a picture of someone incapable of accepting reality, someone who would never stop trying to claim Sam as her own. Theodore McCodor continued filing motions to dismiss or reduce charges. He argued that Layla's mental state made her incapable of forming criminal intent. He submitted letter after letter from my parents attesting to Layla's character, each one more detached from reality than the last. Our prosecutor remained optimistic but honest about our chances. She explained that family court cases involving mental illness rarely resulted in significant jail time. The best we could hope for might be mandatory treatment and extended supervision, assuming we could convince a jury that Layla posed an ongoing threat. The thought of Layla receiving only a slap on the wrist made my blood boil. Sam had almost died because of her delusions. Our daughter had nightmares about her aunt taking her baby brother. Our entire life had been turned upside down, and she might walk away with nothing more than therapy requirements. As the trial date approached, Layla's behavior escalated again. She began showing up at places she thought we might be: the pediatrician's office, the grocery store, the park. She never approached directly, always staying just far enough away to claim coincidence, but her presence was a constant threat. One evening, while loading groceries into our car, I spotted Layla across the parking lot. She stood by a car I didn't recognize, holding a baby doll wrapped in a blanket. She rocked it gently, staring directly at me with an expression that made my skin crawl. When I called the police, she was gone before they arrived. These encounters took their toll on our family. Our daughter became clingy and anxious, afraid to leave our sides. My husband developed insomnia, spending nights checking security cameras and door locks. I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, wondering when Layla would appear next. The stress began affecting Sam, too. He became fussy and difficult to settle, as if sensing the tension around him. His weight gain slowed, concerning his doctors. They ran tests, but found nothing physically wrong. He was simply responding to the anxiety permeating our lives. 3 weeks before the trial, we received devastating news. Theodore McCodor had successfully petitioned for a competency evaluation, claiming Layla wasn't mentally fit to stand trial. If the evaluation supported his claim, the criminal case could be suspended indefinitely while Layla underwent treatment. The prosecutor explained that this was a common defense tactic in cases involving mental illness. If Layla was deemed incompetent, she'd be sent to a psychiatric facility until doctors declared her fit for trial, a process that could take months or even years. During that time, she'd have access to better treatment than prison would provide. My husband slammed his fist on the table when we heard the news. All our evidence, all our preparation might be for nothing if Layla could convince evaluators that she didn't understand the charges against her. Theodore McCodor had found another potential loophole, another way to help Layla avoid consequences. We attended the competency hearing, watching as Layla played up her delusions for the evaluators. She referred to Sam as Josh throughout, claiming she didn't understand why she was being kept from her baby. She cried about missing his first words, his first steps, all the milestones she'd imagined for the child she'd lost years ago. The evaluators asked Layla direct questions about the charges against her. She responded with confusion, insisting she'd only been trying to bring her baby home. When asked about the fake documents, she claimed they were real, that someone must have switched them to frame her. Her performance was convincing in its consistency. My parents testified during this hearing too, supporting Layla's confusion. They claimed she'd been calling Sam by the name Josh for months, that she genuinely couldn't distinguish between her deceased baby and Sam. Their testimony lent credibility to Layla's act, making it harder for evaluators to see through the manipulation. After 3 days of evaluation and testimony, we waited anxiously for the results. The lead evaluator finally delivered her findings. Layla was competent to stand trial. While she suffered from delusional disorder, she understood the nature of the charges and could assist in her own defense. The criminal trial would proceed as scheduled. Layla's mask slipped for just a moment when the ruling was announced. I saw a flash of rage cross her face before she resumed her confused, fragile act. Theodore McCodor immediately filed an appeal, but the judge denied it. We would finally have our day in court. The remaining weeks before trial passed in a blur of preparation and continued harassment. Layla's supporters grew more vocal, organizing protests outside the courthouse. They held signs declaring mental illness is not a crime and justice for Layla. Local news picked up the story, forcing us to dodge reporters whenever we left home. My parents gave interviews to anyone who would listen, painting us as cruel relatives who'd driven Layla to a breakdown. They shared old family photos showing happier times when we'd all gotten along. The narrative they spun made me sick, as if we'd chosen this situation, as if we'd wanted our lives destroyed. Through it all, we focused on protecting our children and preparing for trial. We practiced our testimony until we could recite every detail without breaking down. We gathered character witnesses who'd seen Layla's escalating behavior firsthand. We documented every incident, every threat, every violation of the restraining order. The night before trial was set to begin, I lay awake holding Sam close. His breathing had finally returned to normal, his weight back on track. He was healing physically, but I wondered about the psychological impact of his early trauma. Would he somehow remember the terror of those days with Layla? My husband wrapped his arms around both of us, whispering promises that it would all be over soon. We'd present our case, the jury would see the truth, and Layla would face consequences for what she'd done. Justice would prevail, and we could finally move forward with our lives. But even as he spoke those reassuring words, I knew the truth was more complicated. Whatever happened at trial, Layla would always be out there, fixated on the child she believed was hers. My parents would continue enabling her delusions. The community would remain divided. There would be no clean ending, no perfect resolution. Still, we had to try. We had to stand up in court and tell our truth, hoping 12 strangers would see through the manipulation and lies. We had to fight for Sam's safety and our family's future. Tomorrow, the final battle would begin. The morning of the trial arrived with an unexpected development. My husband discovered a USB drive taped under our mailbox at the rental property. The drive contained hundreds of screenshots from Layla's private social media accounts, showing her detailed planning going back over a year. Someone had anonymously provided us with evidence we'd never have found ourselves. The screenshots revealed Layla had been tracking my menstrual cycles through social media posts about PMS symptoms. She'd calculated when I was most likely to conceive and had prepared her kidnapping plan months before Sam was even born. One particularly disturbing post showed she'd practiced diaper changes on dolls, timing herself to see how quickly she could change and dress a baby. We immediately took the USB drive to our prosecutor. She examined the evidence with growing excitement, recognizing its value in demonstrating premeditation. The metadata showed the screenshots were taken recently, suggesting someone close to Layla had grown uncomfortable with her obsession. That afternoon, while preparing our final testimony notes, my phone rang from an unknown local number. I almost ignored it, but something made me answer. The caller was Layla's ex-husband. He explained he'd been the one who left the USB drive. After their divorce, he'd maintained access to some of her accounts and had been monitoring her increasingly disturbing posts. He offered to testify about Layla's behavior during their marriage, including incidents he'd never reported. He described finding a nursery she'd secretly decorated in their spare room years ago, complete with clothes for a baby that didn't exist. He'd also discovered she'd been taking fertility substances without his knowledge, desperate to conceive after her loss. The prosecutor added him to our witness list immediately. His testimony would provide crucial context about Layla's long-standing delusions and manipulative behavior. It would also counter my parents' narrative that this was simply a grief-induced breakdown rather than a pattern of escalating obsession. On the morning we were supposed to leave for court, we found our rental car's tires slashed, 4 neat cuts in each tire, too deliberate to be random vandalism. Security footage from our neighbor's camera showed a figure in dark clothing approaching our vehicle at 3:00 a.m., but the image quality was too poor for identification. My husband called his brother to pick us up while I contacted the prosecutor about the incident. She advised us to document everything, but warned it would be difficult to prove Layla's involvement. The timing was too convenient to be coincidental, but without clear evidence, it was just another intimidation tactic we couldn't legally address. During the drive to court, our daughter sat between us in the back seat, clutching my hand tightly. She'd insisted on coming, wanting to support us despite our attempts to shield her from the ugliness. My mother-in-law would watch Sam at her house, where we'd installed new security cameras and changed all the locks. The courthouse steps were crowded with Layla's supporters. They held signs with her photo and chanted about injustice. Some recognized us and began shouting accusations. My husband shielded our daughter as we pushed through the crowd, ignoring their cries that we were destroying a grieving mother. Inside the courtroom, I saw Layla sitting at the defense table. She'd styled her hair like mine and wore a dress similar to one I'd worn in photos from Sam's birth. The mimicry was unsettling, as if she was trying to become me. When she turned and saw us, she smiled and mouthed something that looked like, "my baby." My parents sat directly behind Layla, their faces set in stern disapproval as they watched us take our seats. Other relatives filled the rows behind them, creating a wall of family support for Layla. On our side, we had my husband's family and a handful of close friends who'd witnessed Layla's behavior firsthand. The prosecutor opened with a powerful statement about the difference between grief and criminal behavior. She outlined the evidence of premeditation, the months of planning, the fake documents, and the deliberate endangerment of a child with special medical needs. She painted a picture of calculated obsession, not mental illness. Theodore McCoder's opening statement focused entirely on Layla's loss years ago. He described in graphic detail the trauma she'd endured, the baby she'd carried for 7 months only to lose in violence. He argued that her mind had fractured from grief, that she genuinely believed Sam was her child reborn. The first day of testimony focused on the technical evidence. The prosecutor presented the fake documents Layla had created, showing the sophisticated forgery involved. An expert testified about the interstate kidnapping laws Layla had researched, demonstrating her awareness that she was committing crimes. Bank records showed Layla had been saving money for months, depositing small amounts into a separate account she'd hidden from her ex-husband. She'd withdrawn it all just before the kidnapping, using it to fund her escape. The premeditation was undeniable, but Theodore McCoder continued to frame it as delusion-driven behavior. Layla's ex-husband testified on the second day. He described years of increasingly concerning behavior, including Layla's insistence that every pregnant woman she saw was carrying her baby. He'd found journals where she'd written detailed plans to rescue her child from various pregnant acquaintances. The most damaging testimony came when he revealed Layla had attempted something similar with his sister's baby 5 years earlier. She'd shown up at the hospital claiming to be the mother, though she'd backed down when security intervened. The incident had caused a family rift, but they'd never reported it, hoping Layla would get help. My mother took the stand next, and her testimony was exactly what we'd expected. She painted Layla as a devoted sister who'd been pushed to desperation by our cruelty. She claimed we'd flaunted our pregnancy, deliberately triggering Layla's trauma. She even suggested we'd name Sam similarly to Josh to torment Layla. Under cross-examination, the prosecutor exposed the holes in my mother's story. She presented the text messages showing my mother's active participation in planning the kidnapping. When confronted with evidence of her involvement, my mother claimed she'd only been trying to help Layla spend time with her nephew. My father's testimony was brief but equally damaging to our case. He insisted Layla was incapable of understanding her actions were wrong, that she lived in a fantasy where Sam was truly her child. He begged the jury to show mercy, to understand that mental illness had driven his daughter to act. The prosecutor saved the security footage for maximum impact. The jury watched Layla's practice runs, her careful testing of our routines. They saw her entering our home multiple times without taking Sam, clearly demonstrating planning rather than impulsive action. The footage of the actual kidnapping was chilling in its efficiency. When I took the stand, I focused on the facts rather than emotions. I described finding Sam near death, his organs failing from dehydration. I presented the medical records showing how close we'd come to losing him. I detailed the ongoing security measures we'd been forced to implement, the constant fear we lived with. Theodore McCoder's cross-examination was brutal. He questioned why I'd excluded Layla from Sam's life, why I'd been so cruel to a grieving woman. He suggested I'd been jealous of the attention Layla received after her loss, that I'd deliberately gotten pregnant to overshadow her tragedy. I remained calm, answering each question with facts. I explained the progression of Layla's behavior from concerning to dangerous. I described her attempts to breastfeed Sam, her insistence on calling herself Mama, the escalating boundary violations that had forced us to limit contact. My husband's testimony corroborated mine, adding details about the impact on our family. He described our daughter's nightmares, the thousands of dollars spent on security, the job opportunities he'd passed up because we couldn't relocate until the trial ended. He painted a picture of a family under siege. The medical testimony was perhaps the most powerful. Sam's doctor described in clinical detail how close to death he'd been. She explained that another 12 hours, without proper nutrition and hydration, would likely have been fatal. She testified about his ongoing health challenges, exacerbated by the trauma of the kidnapping. Layla's psychiatric evaluation was presented next. While the psychiatrist confirmed her delusional disorder, he also testified that she understood the difference between right and wrong. Her careful planning and attempts to avoid detection demonstrated awareness that her actions were illegal, even if she believed them justified. On the final day of testimony, Layla took the stand. Her performance was masterful in its consistency. She referred to Sam exclusively as Josh, describing in detail the pregnancy she'd lost and her joy at finding her baby again. She cried as she described the pain of being separated from her child. Under cross-examination, however, cracks appeared in her facade. When pressed about the fake documents, she insisted they were real, that the prosecutor was lying. When shown evidence of her months of planning, she became agitated, slipping between referring to Sam and Josh as if they were different children. The moment that likely sealed her fate came when the prosecutor asked about Sam's near-death condition. Layla's response was chilling in its detachment. She insisted Josh had been fine with her, that the hospital must have done something to make him sick. She showed no remorse for his suffering, only anger at being separated from him. During closing arguments, Theodore McCoder made one final plea for mercy. He asked the jury to consider Layla's trauma, her mental illness, the failure of the system to help her after her loss. He painted her as a victim of circumstances, driven to desperate action by untreated grief. The prosecutor's closing was methodical and devastating. She walked the jury through each piece of evidence, showing the careful planning, the deliberate choices, the complete disregard for Sam's well-being. She reminded them that mental illness might explain behavior, but it didn't excuse criminal actions. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. When they returned, I held my husband's hands so tightly my knuckles went white. The foreman stood and delivered the verdict. Guilty on all counts: kidnapping, child endangerment, identity fraud, and interstate flight. The maximum sentence possible was 25 years. Layla's reaction was immediate and violent. She screamed that they were stealing her baby, that Josh needed his mother. She tried to lunge toward us, but was restrained by bailiffs. As they dragged her out, she kept screaming that she'd get him back, that a mother's love couldn't be stopped by prison walls. My parents' faces crumbled as the verdict was read. My mother sobbed openly while my father stared at us with undisguised hatred. They left without speaking to us, but their allegiance was clear. We'd lost them completely, but we'd protected our son. The sentencing hearing came 3 weeks later. The judge considered Layla's mental illness, but also the severity of her crimes and the ongoing threat she posed. He sentenced her to 15 years with the possibility of parole after 10, contingent on psychiatric treatment and demonstrated rehabilitation. We moved to our new state the following week. The house sale had closed, and my husband's new job was waiting. We told no one except his parents our new address. Our daughter started at a new school where no one knew our story. Sam continued to thrive, reaching all his developmental milestones despite his rough start. 6 months later, we received notice that my parents were suing for grandparents' rights. They claimed we'd alienated them unfairly, that they deserved access to their grandchildren. We hired a lawyer and prepared to fight again, knowing this battle was far from over. But for now, we were safe. Sam slept peacefully in his crib, unaware of the chaos he'd survived. Our daughter gradually stopped checking locks obsessively. My husband and I slowly learned to relax, to trust that Layla couldn't reach us from behind bars. The trauma would always be there, woven into our family story. But we'd survived. We'd protected our children. And despite everything we'd lost, we still had each other.